Hi guys, welcome to Tactic Devs. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to implement validations in WPF following the MVVM design pattern. For instance, we're going to implement this application that only allows us to submit this form whenever all these values here are present. And we're also going to look at things like displaying error messages. For example, I have a name field here. If I try to add some characters and get rid of these characters, we see we have an error message that tells us that the name field is required. Now at the moment, I can't submit this form because it requires that all these fields be present. So I'm going to add some characters here and here and here. And here we now see that we can now submit this form. So we're going to be looking at how to implement this type of validation following the MVVM design pattern. So guys, with that being said, let's go to Visual Studio and get to the coding. Alright, here in Visual Studio, I have a WPF project set up. And for this project, I'll be following the MVVM design pattern. Now what I have here is the main view model. So this is a simple UI that consists of labels, text boxes, and a button. This will allow me to input some data and also show visual cues whenever that data is invalid. Now, WPF has got a number of ways that we can use to implement data validations. For instance, if I go to this text boxes code here in the XAML and go to the text property and add a binding, notice that there are a number of properties that we can set here in this binding attribute. But there are 4 of interest. These are the validates on data errors, validates on exceptions, validates on notify data errors, and validation rules. Basically, these are different approaches that we can use to provide validations in WPF. So we can validate using data errors, exceptions, notify data errors, or validation rules. For this tutorial, we are going to go with the notify data errors. Now notice one thing, all these approaches take part in the binding system. So this simply means the validations will take place within the binding pipeline. All right, so I'll go ahead and get rid of this. Now, since I'm following the MVVM design pattern, I need to create a view model for this view. It's basically a class that's going to contain the properties that will be bound to these text boxes for the name, email, and password. So I'll go to the project here and I'll add a new class. And I'll name this class main view model. So for this class, I'm going to start by setting it to a public class. And I'm going to add a number of properties that are going to correspond to the view, like name, email, and password. But before I can do that, I would like to first implement the validation logic. Now for this tutorial, since we are going with the notify data errors approach, we are required to implement an interface on the class that's going to contain the properties that will be bound to the UI. In this case, we understand that that class is the main view model. So we are required to implement a specific interface. This interface is called the NotifyDataErrorInfo. So add that interface, and it will simply provide a notification system to the UI whenever we have data that is not valid on a property. And it will also provide the data error information. So implement this interface, and notice that we have 3 members defined. Has errors, which determines on whether we have errors present. We have an event, which is the errors changed event, and this can be raised whenever our errors have changed. We also have a method called getErrors. So this method will take in a parameter of the type string, which is the name of the property, and then it will get the errors associated with that property and return them as an enumerable, which is basically a list here. Now these members are supposed to be present on this class because they are going to be used during the validation process, by the binding system. But here we need to implement the logic ourselves. So here we see we have a property called hasErrors, and here we also see one called getErrors. So this means we need to store our errors somewhere. So I'm going to start by adding a list, but what I'm going to do is I'll add it in form of a dictionary. So I'll simply say dictionary, and this dictionary is going to have a key of the type string, and it's going to have a value of the type list, and this list will be a list of strings. So basically, when you specify a key, it's going to return a list of strings. I'll name this errors, and I'll set it to a new instance. So this is where we are going to store our errors, and we'll simply store them as error messages in form of a string. So here we have hasErrors. So how do we determine if we have errors? So what I'll do is I'll simply get my dictionary, and I'm going to check the count, which will simply return the number of errors that are present in this dictionary. So if the number is greater than 0, it means we have errors present. If not, then we have nothing. So this is how I'm going to implement this. Now for the getErrors method here, I'll simply come to this and I'll get rid of this line of code. I'll add an if statement, and what I'll do is I'll get my dictionary and say errors, then I'll call a method called contains key. So I'll check if the dictionary contains a key of a specific property name. So the contains key method will simply check if this property has got any errors associated with it. So if it returns true, it means those errors are present. So what do? We simply return those errors. So simply say errors, and I'll specify return. Then I'll simply specify this key, which is the property name. So here, let me just correct this. Right, so if we have any errors associated with this property name, kindly return those errors. If we don't have any errors associated, we can simply return an empty list. So what I'll simply do is I'll say enumerable, then I'll call the empty method and simply specify the type of elements, which is a string, and this will return a list of empty strings. All right, so this is how we do it. So I'm going to add the return keyword, and there we have it. All right, so at this point we have implemented part of this interface. So we have implemented the getErrors method. Now the question is, how do we then add errors to this list? So we add errors to this list when we perform a validation. So if we have a property and we perform a validation and we find that that property has got an error, we simply add that error to this list. And the UI is going to call this method through the binding process. Then it's going to get those messages, and we can display those messages to the user as well as other visual cues. So what I'll do is I'm going to create a method, and I'll name this method validate. So I'll simply say public void validate. Now to perform a validation, we need two properties. So I'll say name, and this will be of the type string. So I'll simply set that to a string. And we also need the value that we are trying to evaluate, and this will be of the type object, and I'll say property value. So how do we perform validations? Well, the .NET libraries have got a class that we can make use of, and that class is called the validator class. So I'll simply come here and I'll say validator class. Then this class contains a method called tryValidateProperty, which allows us to validate a property based on certain conditions. Now those conditions can be set using validation attributes. Now I'm going to talk about that later on. So here we have an argument that we need to specify, which is the value. So I'll specify the value. In this case, it's a property value, but we also need to specify another argument, which is the context. In this case, we need to specify the class that we are trying to get a property from and validate that property. So I'll simply say new validation context, then specify the instance, which is this very class here. But we also need to specify the name of the property that we are trying to validate. So here we can do that by specifying the member name. So we can tell it we want to validate whatever property name will be passed through the method. So I'll say property name. Then lastly here we also need to specify another parameter. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come here and I'll create a variable called results. And this will be a list of an object of the type validation result. So I'll say validation result. So I'll get this results list and pass it to the method here. So what this is going to do is that each time we perform a validation and it returns some results, it's going to store those results inside this list that we specified here when calling the method. So once we have those results, we can then further perform other things. So what I'll do here is I'll use an if statement, and then I'll say if the results contain anything. So if the results contain something, it simply means that we have an error. So what do we do if we have an error? We add those errors to the dictionary here. So what I'll do is I'll simply say errors, and I'll call the add method. Now here we need to specify the key, which is the name of the property. So I'll say property name. Then we also need to specify a list of strings. Remember, we said the values are a list of strings. Now the strings that we need to specify are simply the error messages. And those error messages are contained inside this results object here. Now since this is a list, we can simply perform a selection. So I'll simply say results, and I'll say select. So from these results, only select a single property, and the property is the error message. So for all the results contained, only select the error messages and return them as a list. So I'll say toList, and that should do it. So once we add these errors, we need to do one thing. We need to raise an event. So we need to say the errors have changed. So this is going to notify the UI. So see, add a question mark to ensure that it's not null. Then I'll simply invoke this event. So the sender will be set to this instance, I'm also going to specify some information. So say new data errors changed event args, and it requires that we specify the name of the property that was changed. So in this case, we'll simply say property name. Right, so that's it. So here, if there is any result present, it simply means the data was not valid, and we add that to the errors list. Now suppose there wasn't any result returned, what do we do? So I'll simply specify an else statement here, and what I'll do is I'm going to get the dictionary and I'm going to remove any errors associated with that property. So I'll specify the property name, and that should do it. So here we also need to raise the event. So basically, this is how we perform the validation. So the validation is simply doing two things. It's adding the errors here and removing the errors, as well as notifying the UI when that happens. Now, the validation happens based on certain conditions. So how do we specify these conditions? We specify them using validation attributes. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to add the properties that we are going to be binding to the UI. So I'll simply come here and say property, and I'll add the full type. So I'll simply say this property will be of the type string, and I'll give it a name property. And here I'll set this to an uppercase. So basically, by using the full property, this allows me to have two blocks of code, which is the get and the set methods here. So here I can add extra logic, which will be executed each time I set this property or I try to request this property. All right, now at this point, we can specify a condition for this property. So how do we do that? By specifying an attribute. So here I can simply come and say this property is required. So this can't be null, or it can't be empty. So since it's required, so specify that, and I can also specify the error message that it should return in case it's not specified. So in that case, I'll simply say error message, then I'll simply say name is required. All right, so that should do it. Now here, what I can do is I can simply add some logic. So what I would like to do is that each time I set the name, I would like to validate that name as well. So I can simply call the validation method right here in the set method. So I'll say validate, and we know that validate has got two parameters that it takes in. The first one is the name of the property, not the value of the property, but the name. So to do that, we'll simply use the name of keyword. The name of keyword, then I'll specify the property, which is the name property, and here the value will be this value here. Now we understand that this is a keyword, so I'll just say value, and that should do it. So whenever I set the name, it will call the validate. If the name is valid, it won't add an error and it won't inform the UI. If it is invalid, the opposite will happen. All right, so this is for the name property. We also need to do it for the email and password. So I'll go ahead and add a full property of the type string. I'll simply say email. I'll do the same for the password. All right, So for these, we also have to call the validate method each time they are set. So simply copy this, paste it here, and we also need to specify the name here. So I'll change this to email so that the validate method knows which property we are dealing with. Now here we have specified the attribute for the name property. We can also do the same for the email and password. So all these are required. The email will be required as well as the password. So for each property we can set a custom message. So here we're going to say email is required. Here we can say password can't be empty, or password is required. All right, so there we have it. Let's have a quick recap. So we see here we have implemented the interface as well as the validate method. We add and remove based on the validation status. All right, so there we have it. So I'll go ahead and save this, and then I'll go to the main window, view here. So here I'm now going to set up the data binding. So to do that, we need to specify a data context for this window. And since I'm following the MVVM design pattern, I'm going to do it right from within the XAML here. So I'll say this Windows data context is equal to an instance of the main view model. So main view model. All right, so we now have the main view model's data available to us. So here I'll bind this text property of this text box here to the name. So that's a name. Now here we see we have name available. So bind. Here we also see we have email. And we see there's a blue icon here. It simply means we are getting this from our data context. And this is because we specified it here in the XAML. Okay. I'll do the same for the password. So by default, this should validate any wrong data input. Now this is possible because the validation takes place within the binding pipeline. So it's part of the binding system. Now here we are using this method, which is the NotifyDataErrorInfo. And we have done that by simply implementing this interface. So WPF is going to automatically understand what we want to do. So let's go ahead and run the application. All right, so the application is up and running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to write some text here and get rid of this text. Then I'll try to lose the focus. And there we go. We see we have a visual cue here indicating that something is wrong with the data that we tried to input here. We can do the same for the email. So this is happening every time we try to set the name, the email, and the password. But this only happens when we lose focus. So if I lose focus from the password, that's when it actually sets the password. So by default, it will set the property when we lose focus. But what I would like to do is to set the property every time we change the text here. So I'm going to do that. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do is I would like that this form only be submitted when these three properties are valid. All right, so I'll go ahead and close this and implement that. All right, so here, to ensure that this is set every time I change the property, what I'm going to simply do is I'll simply update the source trigger, which is our code behind, every time when the property has changed. So simply update this value when the property has changed, instead of when the focus is lost. All right, I'll do the same for this and for that. Okay, so at this point, what I would like to do is I would like to ensure that this can only be submitted when these three properties are valid. We have currently tested that this property cannot be left empty. It shows us a visual cue. All right, so what I'm going to do here is, since I'm using the MVVM design pattern, I need to specify a command for this pattern here. We are not going to use click events, so I use a command. Now a command is simply an instance or an object that's going to perform an action, right? It's going to perform an action, so it's simply an object, but that object has to implement a specific interface, and that interface is called the iCommand interface. So before we can proceed here, I'm going to create a class here in my project, and I'll name this project action command. So this class here will be set to a public class and has to implement an interface called the iCommand interface. I'll go ahead and implement this interface. So basically, this interface has got two actions that are performed, and these actions are performed in a sequence. So the first one is called the can execute. This action will return a boolean, and this boolean will simply determine whether this will execute or not. So if this returns true, then this method here will be executed. Now for this class here, what we can do is we can define some logic here that's going to determine when it's going to be executed or not. But we do not want to define that logic here. What we want to do is we would like to define it somewhere else and then inject that logic into this class here. So to do that, what I'll do is I'll add a constructor. Then this constructor is going to take in two arguments. The first one will be called action. And this action is simply a method, and this method is going to take an object as the parameter. And I'm going to give it a name. I'll simply name it execute. I'm going to add another method, and this method is going to return a boolean. It's going to return whether it's true or false. So basically, I'm replicating these two types of methods here, but this time they have to be injected through the constructor. So a method that returns a boolean can be stored inside a variable called a predicate. So I'll simply say a predicate, but this predicate has to take in an object so that it's the same as this here. So this can execute takes in an object. So here I also specify that this predicate takes in an object, and I'll simply give it a name, can execute. All right. So what I'd like to do is, once I pass these through the constructor, I would like to store them in some variables here. So once I store them in the variables, I can then use them in the class. So what I'll do is, with the help of Visual Studio, I'll simply come here and I'll say create and assign field. All right, I'll do the same for this one. So create and assign field. So what this has done is it has created two variables here so that I can access them within this class. Then here in the constructor, what it does, it simply takes in the two methods that we pass through the constructor and assigns them to these variables here. So we now have the two methods that are passed through the constructor stored here. So what do we do with those methods that are stored here? We simply execute them inside here. So for the can execute, what I do is I simply say return, then I'll get this method that was stored here. So the method that was stored here, I'll simply specify by saying this, then I'll say can execute in small letters. Okay. And this method also takes in an object, so I'll simply pass it this parameter object. And that's it. So for the can execute here, we have it done. We also do the same for the execute. The execute is simply an action. It doesn't return anything. So I'll simply say this, then I'll say execute. I'll pass it the parameter object, and that's it. So this parameter object sometimes may be no, or sometimes we can pass data, but we need to ensure that we have passed this. So basically, this class performs an action. So it has two methods, but we don't want to define the logic in this class. So what do? Is we allow this class to receive two methods through the constructor. Then we can execute these in turn. So whenever this is called, it will simply call the method that was passed through the constructor. All right, so that's it. So go ahead and save this action command and close it. Now I'll go to the main view model. Here in the main view model, I'm going to add a constructor right here at the bottom. All right. Now here, I'm also going to add a property. So I'll simply say property, and this property will be of the type action command. And I'll name this action command submit command. All right, here in the constructor, I'll simply set it to a new instance. So I'll say my submit command is equal to a new instance of the action command. But the action command takes in two methods. So we need to point it to two methods. The first method is the execute method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say submit method. Then the second one is the can submit method. So the can submit method will determine on whether we can submit or not. So I'll say can submit. So apparently we do not have these methods defined here. So with the help of Visual Studio, it can help me quickly generate these methods. So right here, I'll come to show potential fixes. Then I'll simply say generate method. All right, so here's my method. It takes in an object just like we specified. And here's another one. It returns a boolean because we said it's a predicate. All right. So here I can now place the logic that is going to determine on whether this can submit or cannot submit. Okay. So to determine on whether this can submit or not, what we need to do is, first let's go to the main view here. For this to be enabled, we need to ensure that all these three properties are valid. So we need to ensure that the entire object is valid and that not a single property is invalid. So what I'll do here is I need to return true or false. So what I'm going to do is I'll use the validator class. I'll say validator, and the validator class allows me to validate the entire object. So I'll say try validate object, and here it takes in an instance, which is the value. So I'll say get this same object. Then it also takes in a validation context. So say the validation context is this very class. Then here we have the results. We do not need to do anything with the results, so I'll simply specify no here because I won't be using the results. Now this method is going to return true or false based on whether this entire class is valid or not. So when the entire class is valid or not, it simply means these properties with attributes here are valid. All right. So this will ensure that we can submit. So here, when performing submit, what do? We simply say message box show message, then simply say submitted. So at this point, what we can do is we need to go to our main window view here, and we need to specify a command here. So the command that we are going to specify, we do it by setting a binding. So we say bind this to the submit command, and there we see the submit command. So when this button is clicked, it is going to perform whatever we defined in those two methods. So these two methods are here. One will determine on whether we can submit, then one will actually submit. All right, so let's go ahead and try the application. All right, so the application is up and running. Now we see by default, this button is disabled. And why is that? It's because it tried to validate the object and it found that these properties were empty. So it said, you know what, I'm not going to allow you to submit. So if we try to set some values here, and let me try to get rid of this, immediately I get rid of the last character, you see that we have a validation queue here, which is a red line around this text box. Now this is happening immediately I get rid of that last character. Previously I had to lose focus. Now this is happening because we changed that behavior by default. Now notice one thing. If I add something here and add something here, we see that this is not being enabled. It's supposed to be enabled each time I do that because all these three properties are now valid. Now the reason this is happening is because whenever we use the command class, we also need to raise an event whenever we feel that the can execute has changed. So in this case, the can execute changes when all these three are valid. So we need to go and fix this. Now let's go ahead and close this, and let's go to the action command class here. Now here in the action command class, we have an event called the can execute changed event. Now notice that we haven't used this event anywhere. So we need to call this event whenever we feel that the can execute has changed. So events can only be called from within the class. So we can only call this event within this class. We can't call it outside the class, but we want to call it from outside the class. So to do that, we create a method here. It's a public void. Then I'll name this method raise can execute changed with a long name. Okay. So since we can't execute this event from outside, we create a method. Then inside that method, we simply invoke that event. Here we pass it the sender, we say this, and the event args. So at this point, we are simply creating a method which we can call from outside, and then this will simply invoke the event. So it's like we are invoking the event from outside this class. All right, so I'll go ahead and save this and go back to the view model here. So we have our submit command here. So when do we want to change or notify the button that the can changed event has been raised? So we would want to do that every time we perform a validation, and that can be placed inside the validate method here. So every time we perform a validation, just kindly update. So what we'll do is we'll say submit command, and it now has a method that we can call, and that method is the raise can execute changed. So we simply raise that, and that will notify the button, and the button will update its state based on that. All right, so let's go ahead and run the application. Okay, so at this point the button is disabled. If this, it validates, this is also validates this, and finally we see that we can submit, and we see the message appears. Immediately I get rid of this, we can't submit anymore, and the same applies for this. Now the question is, how can we display the error message here, since we do not know what's really happening? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll close this. Let's go to the main. So here in the main view, one of the easiest ways to display an error message is to use the tooltip. So I'll simply go to this text box here, and I'll specify a tooltip, and I'll simply set a binding. Now the binding that I'm going to set is a relative resource. And that relative resource is going to have a mode, and the mode is simply going to be set to self. So I'm simply trying to get information from this very text box itself. So here what I'm going to do is I'll specify the path. Now for the path, I'm going to use a class. So this will be the validation class, and the validation class has got a property called errors. So this is an attached property which will allow me to extract errors that are associated to the binding that we have made on this text box. So I'll simply get the errors at the first index, then what I'll do is I'll get the error content and display it as part of the tooltip. So that should do it. So I'll go ahead and run the application. Alright, so if I come here and get rid of this, notice that if I over here, we see it says name is required. So we're extracting that information from the very control itself here. So we see the name is required. We can do the same for the email. Now the other thing is we can also display it by simply placing a label here at the bottom of this text box. So I'll go ahead and close this, and I'll get rid of this tooltip that I created. And here I need a way of creating this label here. So I'll simply get this label that I created here, and I'll paste it down here. I'm going to get rid of the content here, and I'm going to set the margin so that it actually moves to this position. So I'll simply add maybe 140. Right, so right now we have the label placed here, which is a very good position for the error message. So now what I'll do is I'll give this text box a name. So I'll simply say the name is equal to the name text box. All right. Now here in the content of this label that I created here, I'll simply create a binding. Now I'll bind it to the text box here. So I'll simply say element name, then I'll say name text box. Then what do I want to get from this text box? I want to get the validation information that is associated with the binding here. So I'll simply specify path. I'll say path, then path. I don't need to specify whether this is relative and self, because I've already specified that I'm getting it from the text box. So here in the path, I'm going to say validation class, then I'll get the errors, then I'll simply get the errors at the error at the first index, then I'll extract the error content. The error content is basically the error message. So here we look at the error content. So I'll go ahead and save this. Let's go to our view model. All right, so here we have our error content and it's placed here. But what I would like to do is I would like to change the foreground to red so that it appears as red. So I'll simply say foreground, then I'll say red. So right now we do not see anything because there's no error associated with the binding here. So let's go ahead and try the application. All right, so application is up and running, and here we type something, then we get rid of this, and there you see we now have name is required. So there are a number of ways that we can do that, and here we can submit. If I add something here and then finally add something here, I can now submit. So thanks guys for watching this video. So you can use this logic when you're trying to do form submissions. Now I'm going to link the source code to this project in the video description. Thanks for watching. Give this video a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to this channel if you find this content useful. I'll see you in the next one.